Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Tentacon video, we're going to be taking a look at building a PlayStation 4 or Xbox One using PC parts. Now, this video was inspired by a couple of fans, and they asked me quite clearly, what would you need in terms of hardware to build a system that is able to compete or exceed that of either Sony's or Microsoft's machine? Now, there are a few footnotes that we need to go into first. The first of which is there are obvious distinct differences between the PS4, for example, and the PC. One of those would be, as it turns out, unified memory. Now, there's not much we can do about that, just because of the way that current PCs work. However, that's not really a major problem, because as it turns out, the PS4 and the Xbox One, although they rely on this large memory pool for obvious storing of textures, graphical data and so on, it's not too much of an issue, because as it turns out, graphics cards on PCs have large memory pools anyway of dedicated memory. And those memory pools on the graphics cards also have access to very fast amounts of RAM. Of course, for example, if we are going to talk about one of the graphics cards that we're going to use in our little test here, we're going to use, for example, the AMD Radeon 7870. Now, that has about 153.6 gigabits per second of memory bandwidth. Now, this is very important. Now, a couple of people are already going to point out that that's somewhat lower than what the PS4 has, but you've got to bear in mind that that memory bandwidth is also shared among the CPU as well as the GPU itself. In other words, that bandwidth is being used for multiple points. In this instance, it's not. It's just being used exclusively for graphical, for graphical processors. Now, another small point is obviously the amount of memory. On a PC, there are overheads, such as operating system, which is obviously going to be far larger than the operating system of even the Xbox One, which you know has a fairly large memory footprint. To this end, we're going to be using 8 gigabytes of DDR3 memory. Now, the purpose of this, in theory at least, is that we shouldn't really have to worry about memory. That should be more than sufficient for, say, for example, Windows 7 or Linux, whatever your chosen operating system is, to be running in the background. And on top of that as well, it should be sufficient for various other components as well, such as driver layer and whatever, especially when you factor in graphics card memory too. So we should be able to get relatively decent specification. Now, another point that we have to make before going into this heavily is obviously a game running on a PlayStation 4 or an Xbox One is going to be heavily tailored towards that system. In other words, it will achieve a maximum efficiency on that console. Therefore, performance will be better. To put it another way, if you have exactly the same specifications of a PC and a console, the PC will lose, simply because the console has been engineered specifically, in other words, with a small operating system. The game has been specifically coded to fully utilize that operating system and the hardware upon it extremely well. Now, as it turns out, we're actually able to be slightly above the PlayStation 4 specs, and this does not include overclocking. Now, for those of you who are not that familiar with the processes of overclocking, I'm sure many of my regular viewers are, but just in case you're not, the process of overclocking is very simple. You have a part and you will simply run it faster than what the manufacturers intended. Indeed, most of parts now, especially when it comes to GPUs or graphics cards if you prefer, actually have the ability out the box, as it turns out, to overdrive. In other words, to automatically overclock their speed based upon their power consumption as well as the heat, in other words, the ambient temperature. If they feel, for example, that they're becoming in danger, in other words, if they're getting to a point where they feel that they should start to down throttle, then they'll come towards normal stock clocks. However, you will as well be able to manually increase the frequencies of the CPU and GPU should you so desire. There are a few other caveats as well that we'll speak about as we're recording the video, so we're getting to that as and when. Now this list, by any stretch of the imagination, is by no means set in stone. In other words, you can quite happily adjust this based upon your own needs and desires. Specifically speaking, the CPU as well as the memory can be adjusted, and of course even the GPU itself. It's worth noting that the GPU does eat a significant portion of the budget up. However, should you so wish, you could spend a little bit more. I'm just going to be using UK pound prices, although by all means you could do the exercise with me and use Amazon or whatever store that you want in your respective region and go for it that way. I'm just using pound prices because otherwise it's going to become extremely confusing if I'm using dollar prices and every other thing under the sun. So there you have it. So first thing we're going to do is choose a CPU. Now, we know that the AMD Jaguar inside the PlayStation 4 has an APU, by which it means that the graphics card and CPU cores are tied onto the same die. Now, this is very important because that means the PS4 can do asynchronous computing. We can't really mirror that right now. There are options available, but for the most part, they're fairly early on in the PC's life, and in my perspective at least, I don't really think they're that important right now anyway, because most games aren't going to use them, and in the future when the games on the PC are going to use them, it's not going to be too much of a problem. Fortunately speaking, there are a couple of alternatives, specifically regular processors as well as a powerful GPU combination. Now, for CPUs on the PC, there are a plethora of different options. I've actually decided for the most part on this build to keep with AMD, simply because it limits our component options somewhat, which is good because I don't want this video to become ridiculously complicated and convoluted. In addition to that, it also helps to choose a component selection that is fairly close to that, or at least as close as possible to the PS4. Now, what we're going to be selecting is the AMD Pile Driver FX 6-core. This is the 6300 Black Edition. Now, currently this is available at various points. You can get this from anything from around £90 up or down a few pennies, depending on how much you shop around. I'm just going to take the median at prices that I'm finding here, just because I think it's fairest. Now, that CPU is a 6-core. Now, as many of you are going to immediately point out that the PS4 and indeed the Xbox One do only actually have 8 cores. First of all, there are a couple of points that we need to make on this. Firstly, 1 to 2 cores of those CPUs. We're not exactly sure right now how many cores of those CPUs are going to be used for operating system exclusive functions. Second point, and you'll automatically make this anyway, Windows itself is going to utilize some of the CPU core. I'm talking on the PC side. However, the CPU of the PS4, as it turns out, isn't that great. This is not a slight on the system, it's just the way it's been engineered. The CPU doesn't have to be that manly and beefy. So this CPU, in terms of performance, by all means, you could do some Googling. There is some documentation actually on redgaminhtech.com if you wish to go to that website, or I've done some videos, tech analysis of the AMD Jaguar, and so on and so forth. So you guys could check that out if you really want more information. However, just believe me when I say that this CPU, in terms of raw power, is going to be better than the AMD Jaguar CPU. There are numerous options for a motherboard. I've just selected almost a placeholder one. It's just a standard Gigabyte AMD 970 board. It's an AM3, and that will cost us about $60. Now, inside both consoles, the PS4 and Xbox One, we need memory. And of course, on the PS4, you're using the GDDR5 RAM. Now, the reason that it has used this, of course, is because a lot of that memory bandwidth is going straight towards the GPU. The PC doesn't really need to worry about this, and its memory bandwidth, for the most part, is going to be utilized by the CPU. There are other concerns, of course, depending on how much texture swapping there is going to be, as well as various other bits and pieces, but for the most part, the CPU is going to be using the large chunk of this. So in that case, we're going to be using an 8GB pair of DDR3 memory. That's going to cost you about £50 to £60. Once again, 50 to 60. That depends on the speed, whether you want, say, to get 1600 megahertz, or whether you want to go a little bit faster. Once again, a lot of the spec is completely configurable up to you. Now, hard drive. There are numerous hard drives available, of course. We know the PS4 and the Xbox One is using a 500GB drive, so I've stuck with that. As it turns out, you can actually get a better, bigger drive for not much more. But I saw this drive, and it's about £40 for this C-Grade Barracuda. That's, once again, SATA, 6GB per second, and that's 16MB cache. It's not the very best out there, but it's not abysmal either. So, that brings us to probably the most important part of the system. That would be the graphics card. We're looking at UK prices. I've managed to find an AMD Radeon HD 7870. That will cost us £160. I'm not going to bother to mention the places I've found these, by the way, simply because I don't want to give them free advertising or whatever. But you can Google, or you can simply message me if you want to know where they are. I don't really, just for obvious reasons, but you can Google them or use Google Shopping or whatever you want to do. Most of them, however, are really big names, so it shouldn't be too hard for you to follow in my footsteps should you so wish. Anyway, this graphics card has 2GB of memory, and it has, as it turns out, 2GB of memory, and it runs at 1000 megahertz. We're talking about the graphics clock here, as well as puts out about 2.56 T-flops of computing power. That's well above the PS4, and roughly double that to the Xbox One. Now, that is some room in the budget, and that's lucky because for those of us who are following along, there are a couple of components missing. Specifically, you'll notice that I haven't mentioned a case or power supply. A reasonable power supply and case combination will cost you a variety of different prices. A lot of cases is based upon your aesthetic needs and desires. If you're one of those people who absolutely must have a really cool looking case with all blue neon lights, then it's going to cost you more. If, on the other hand, you don't really give a rat's ass what the case looked like, as long as it holds the components and does a relatively decent job in cooling them, then you're going to be paying less. As it turns out, you can get a reasonable combination of PSU and case for about £32. On the other hand, it's not going to be the best quality PSU, so if you do so wish to, you could plump a little bit more money down, say another £20 or so, and that would cost you about £50 total, and that would get you a much better combination. Now, some among you will notice that I have not selected an optical drive. There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, they are dirt cheap, a DVD drive. Now, I know what you're going to scream. Why the hell would I want a DVD drive? Well, as it turns out on PC, most games now aren't really needed. For example, if I was to go into a local store, I could get a boxed game, even though the selection is going to be pretty pitiful at this point. However, you would basically not use that game to install it most of the time unless you have a really slow internet connection. You would simply use the serial key, and a lot of the same stuff for downloading games as well. You've of course got Steam, Origin, Ubisoft and so on that you can use to download your games. So yeah, even operating systems now can be installed via USB flash drive or whatever, and so it's not that much of a big deal. So, what have we learned from this? Well, a few things. First of all, that you can get quite a decent system for this. Now, some people are immediately going to argue, and I don't want to turn this into a console versus PC. That's not the purpose of this video. This is merely a thought process. This is more just see what we can get for the same money. This is more just for fun, and kind of an educational experience for all of us concerned. Now, there are going to be some arguments, of course, about you need a screen. To be honest, I don't really think that's a big deal. You can plug this system quite happily. It will have an HDMI, if I can get the word out, to a TV. And so, by all means, you could plug that into your, 20-inch TV or your 55-inch TV or whatever you happen to have, and that will work hunky-dory as well as all the sound outputs. There are a couple of other points I'd like to make on this selection. First of all, there are games for free on this deal. So what do you get for free, I hear you cry? Well, it heavily depends where you shop around. Some places are giving away Tomb Raider with the graphics card. Other people are giving Far Cry. One place is even giving Bioshock and Crysis and Blood Dragon, as well as... Actually, no, I'm sorry, I thought I read that wrong. I thought it said Far Cry 3 and Blood Dragon, but no, for some reason they're labeling it Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon. I suppose technically that is the name, but you know what I mean. So anyway, technically you're getting free games, which is not bad, as it turns out. I suppose if you wanted those games initially, then you're saving some cash. Other places give away free games with, say, hard drives or memory or CPUs or whatever. So it really is a case of shopping around. Now, the reason I point this out is it can lower your budget. For example, let's assume that your budget for a game and a console is X. Well, if you do this, obviously, then at least you get a couple of free games with it. Now, once again, this is not a PC is better. This is not a console is inferior. This is merely to point out that you can quite happily, for the same kind of cash, build a PC that is easily going to be able to rival in terms of graphics. Now, I'm going to make a few modifications on this specifications, just because a couple of OC UKers have pointed out how much graphics cards, certain graphics cards have dropped recently in price. And as that turns out, you can get some really killer systems. For a little bit more money, you're looking at about 220. You can get the 7950. This definitely has considerably more grunt. You're looking at 240 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth. This is once again just on the GPU. You're looking at 3 gigabytes of GDDR5 RAM. Once again, just to reiterate, that amount of memory is just for textures and so forth, which is more than enough at the moment for games, especially if we were talking at 1080p or even 1600p quality. Indeed, there have been, and by all means, feel free to do some Googling on this. I have done videos on this before, but you can also just Google it. There's several results showing memory usage of games such as Far Cry 3 and Crysis 3, which of course are two of the biggest graphical killers on the system at the moment. Just how much memory they take at 1080p. It's actually less than 2 gigs. So you're looking at about 1.5 at 1080p. Your mileage may vary depending on levels of anti-aliasing and strobic filtering and or other effects. But even in the future, say a couple of years' time, you're probably not going to be looking at much more than, 3 gigs. But whatever. At least for the time being. Obviously, I can't state that forever and a day. So what about if you're talking about the 7950? Well, then you're looking at about 2.87 T-flops of computing power. So that's about, once again, about 1 T-flop more than the PS4. Now, obviously, once again, just to reiterate the purpose of this video, there are significant differences between the architecture of a PC and PS4. For example, one of the benefits of the PS4 is going to be asynchronous computing, which of course allows the graphics card to help out a lot with computational tasks. Now, we do know that the PC can actually do some of this if you were to go with, say, a rival competitor of AMD, NVIDIA. Then you can get PhysX games, and they do run hardware physics, which aren't supported with all titles. However, certain titles are supported, and as it turns out, a lot of games now are starting to become a lot more reliant on this stuff, and I wouldn't be surprised if the graphics cards of these systems naturally, as PCs evolve, become a lot more like, oh okay, you need a graphics card that can handle this. So in other words, say the Radeon HD 7800 range above, because obviously they are very good at handling this stuff. Remember, the 7900 or 7800, indeed any of the 7000 ranges, use exactly the same GCN core technology that is found inside the PS4 or the Xbox One for that matter. So once again, just to reiterate, I'm going to give you guys the totals based upon if you are going with the 7870, that's about £430. Now, I'll just stress that will get you free games. Now, there is no operating system included in these costs. However, your mileage may vary on an operating system and its costs. There are ways there are free trials available, for example, for a couple of operating systems that will get you, 60 or 90 days on your system. So technically you could do it that way. You could also look at it that a copy of, say, with Windows 7 or 8, it's going to cost you anything between, what am I looking at? No, wait, that's an upgrade price. You're looking at anything for about £70, £60, £60 to £70, and that will get you the standard version of either Windows 7 or 8. Once again, you can Google this stuff and you can do some shopping around or whatever. Hey, maybe you've already got a PC and it's a retail copy, so by all means you can use your version of Windows 7, for example, on a new PC. That is fine, and that is completely and utterly down to you, of course. Obviously, depending on your setup. It's also possible that you may already have some parts, for example, a hard drive that's relatively big, or you might have, say, optical drive or a decent PSU, and therefore you could just transfer that over to the new system. Once again, all of this stuff is assuming that you have nothing. In other words, that you're accessing the internet on, or you just want to build a completely separate machine, or your current PC is blown up, or whatever. So I just wanted to show you what is possible on a console budget. Once again, this is not a PC versus console. I actually happen to like both. And just for the purposes of playing peace, I do actually have a PS4 on pre-order. I will also be pre-ordering the Xbox One. And of course, I also game on PC. So once again, not showing favoritism or anything like that. This is not meant to start a war, even though some people are probably going to use it as an excuse. That's not the purpose of it. This is merely just to show you guys what you can do with the money. Further and last point I'd like to make, obviously there are problems with PCs. You obviously will find that the specs will diminish over time, and that's fine. You can do what I normally do for PCs. I actually typically find that I buy a certain amount of games per year, and what I used to do is that I pretty much used to just save up the money that I did spend on the games, and because obviously you can save quite a bit of money because PC games are a little bit cheaper, and then you can simply put that into a little kitty to help you upgrade, which is one way to do it. But honestly speaking, if you're going a mid-range to mid-high end on PCs, then you could get a decent system fairly cheap. Also, you could eBay the parts and get them used. Personally, my own personal standpoint on this, and once again, this is speaking from a personal point of view rather than, facts and figures. I personally would not buy a CPU or GPU, especially CPU used, because some people overclock the crap out of the CPU. Now, obviously that your mileage may vary. You may buy a CPU off eBay and 6 years later it's still running. On the other hand, you could find that you have problems. That is totally up to you. It's your money after all. So anyway, also, of course, you can overclock your system. Just how overclockable it is extremely depends on what parts you have, as well as luck of the draw. So it turns out that you may be able to get 10% out of the card or CPU more, or you may be able to get 30%. It depends on what you're buying, for example. Anyway, that's just about it for this video. It's been a fairly interesting look at this. So just to reiterate, if anyone has any questions on this, you can post them on the video below, but you're probably much more likely to get a response simply because of the amount of people who message me and stuff on YouTube. You're much more likely to get a response on Facebook. So if you do so wish to, then you can go to facebook.com/redgamingtech. Anyway, that's about it for this particular video. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. I will see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.